Hello, I'm Irit Rogoff, and my field of work is visual culture, which I teach academically at Goldsmiths in London. And I also work as a curator in the curation of concepts, not so much of works of art, but in efforts to make concepts visually and performatively manifest in public culture, and in organizing, which is a slightly vague term, but has to do with trying to bring people together around certain ideas and certain endeavors. The collective free thought came together at a moment which, at a kind of double moment. It was a moment where, for me, questions of education and the need to compensate for what was happening in institutions as they became increasingly neoliberal in their outlook, emphasizing results, outcomes, employment prospects, and increasingly financialized in their aims. The impetus was to try and see what other kinds of spaces could in some way balance out what was happening within kind of institutions of intensive teaching and research culture. And one of the areas that seemed to be developing in that direction was the art world and its institutions. And my entry point into this was a series of very big exhibitions across 3 cities in Europe, which was called Academy, and in which we asked, in the case of the one I curated in Van Abbe in Eindhoven, was to ask the question of what can we learn from the museum beyond what the museum shows us. So the museum exposes certain things to us, mostly artworks and activities related to these artworks. But I was really interested in questions of the structure of what underwrites collecting, what underwrites the kind of personal and collective ambitions of the people who work there, what possibilities there are for bringing publics in, not just to look at artworks and so on. And so the questions around education kind of met up with initiatives within the art world, within this particular project. And then subsequently, with a group of friends and colleagues, we decided to set up a collective, which we called Free Thought, which would kind of think about knowledge production outside of the institution. So taking on board the kind of limitations of working in the institution because of the kind of onus of outcomes and general drive of institutionalized education, and to think about how we could collectively create moments and events of knowledge outside of the institution. So using everything that we had at our disposal to think about creating events of knowledge outside of the institution. Maybe that's enough for the moment.
Yeah, that's great. So my name is Massimiliano Mollona, and I'm also based in Goldsmiths. And I'm an anthropologist, and my interest is to look at the intersection between especially art and political economy. And so to look at the artistic space as a space of prefiguration and of imagining of possible worlds in relationship to contemporary capitalism and colonial capitalism. And on the other hand, it's also I'm also interested in the economies of art and in the process and in the labor of art and art making, in the skills of art making. And so to me, these two aspects are always combined together. And also as anthropologist, I found that there is a really there is a big affinity between curating anthropology and art practices in the way process of fieldwork that I experience are substantially process of curating and let's say creating dialogical encounters, dialogical knowledge that are also durational, are also pedagogical. And so I was very interested in this intersection between knowledge production and practice, which is the way in which Irit and I came together in a conversation about how university could really make a greater connection between practices of let's say, of word making, or practices of prefiguration of alternative alternative social relation, alternative worlds. And so for me, free thought was this very important space in which I could really look at engagement with artists, but also with, first with thinker, so with Irit, with Adrian, with Stefano, with Nora and Luis, who had similar urgencies, similar urgencies of bringing together practice and knowledge production. And so this pedagogical moment for me is very important. It's also a political moment in the sense that I'm also interested in ways in which knowledge can be common, can be a process of commoning of knowledge, process of commoning of imagination, and process of commoning of storytelling, and so yes, that's basically was the beginning of free thought.
Mm-hmm. So we came together in 2013, and after doing sort of a few kind of small things to test out our ability to kind of talk with and through one another, we were invited by Buck to take part in the final conference of Former West, which was held in Berlin. And for that event, we started thinking together about questions of infrastructure. Now, we should say, and I'm sure that all of us will kind of say it in different ways, we should say that the interest in infrastructure is not necessarily the interest in the kind of material underpinnings of our actions. The interest in infrastructure for us is a kind of drive to examine and to understand forms of governance, to understand these through cultural formations. So as we were working in Bergen, which was a kind of very privileged situation because we had 2.5 years, a good budget, a lot of autonomy, and as I think Stefano said in one of our meetings recently, the opportunity to create our own universe. And what we began to kind of understand is that infrastructure, as we were perceiving it, is not something that serves us and sustains us and enables us, but it is something that we have internalized to a point where we've become infrastructural beings, right? The sort of not those who benefit from infrastructures, but those whose modus operandi and values are in a way dictated by infrastructures. And it was that kind of nexus between infrastructure and subjectivity that we really needed to uncover. And so we set out in a series of 6 projects that were to some extent different from one another, but were largely joined by this understanding that infrastructure was a form of governance, that understanding it through cultural formations would help us gain a certain kind of insight that, let's say, a sociological analysis or in economical analysis would not suffice to. And that what we should do is experimentally try our hand at different aspects of it, and then come together in order to kind of draw together the insights, reach certain amounts of conclusions, understand where this might lead us to. So I worked on a project which I'll say a bit later has carried on into spectral infrastructure of what I called assembled archives. A lot of this is a kind of intuitive, it's an intuitive drive based on certain kinds of knowledge, but not a clear understanding of what I'm doing. And so there's never, because it's so largely intuitive, there's never the danger of illustrating an idea, right? The work is always an exploration to understand what the intuition is based on. And in this particular case, it was to understand the way in which certain kind of archives assembled by people who are not in any way neutral in relation to the subject, but deeply, deeply invested in it, that are assembled in order to make an invisible visible. And so Vali Mahlouji was an Iranian curator, curated the archive of the Shiraz-Persepolis festival, which was a really interesting, for 10 years, 63 to 73, it brought together the decolonizing world together with Western avant-gardes, trying to find moments of connection. Mike Berlin, a historian, assembled an archive of the Partisan Café in London, which was the genesis of a whole set of left-wing initiatives and movements in London in the late 50s, early 60s. And together with our colleague Nora Sternfeld, we made an archive called an Anecdoted Archive of Exhibition Lives, trying to, through a series of video interviews that students in our programs carried out around the world, countries that they came from, trying to understand the way in which exhibitions open up certain worlds where they might not exist, right? That they become a kind of arbiters of possibilities in a way that the world in which these people that were interviewed might not have openings to, and that their impact lasts long, long after the exhibitions themselves close. So how exhibitions are in a way projecting into the future rather than satisfying a consumerist need for culture in the present. So these were the kind of assembled archives that I was working with.
Yeah, thank you, Irit. Your description of our involvement in Bergen, yes, I really identify with it. It was a special, extraordinary moment in which we were free to thinking about this notion of infrastructure. And I think that for me, as Irit was saying, the most interesting aspects of this is precisely the fact that that notion allowed us to look at kind of underline and look at moments of fugitivity, of moments of kind of dysfunctionality, moments of entanglement, of uncertainty, and these kind of subaltern movements. So it was a way to, let's say, look at infrastructure in a counterintuitive ways, as Irit was saying. And my project, The End of Oil, was precisely looking at this kind of invisible affective component of the economy of oil, or economy in general, but especially of the economy of oil in Norway, where there is this kind of friction between the fact that Norway is a social democracy and is very politically so advanced, and of course an example for in Europe that is kind of verging towards the right. But at the same time, all these social progressive condition is fueled by oil. And so there is an undergoing undercurrent feeling of unease about this. And I was very interested in uncovering that. And so the project really developed, thanks to, as Irit was saying, this amazing condition we were working in, through a series of workshops with economists, with technological experts, with futurologists, with trade union representatives, which was aimed at sketching a future of Norway without oil. And so people gave different vision of this future without oil. And then from that kind of prefiguration of the future without oil, I set up two collaborations. One was with the visual artist Phil Collins, with whom we created a very short, 2 minutes long anime film that, let's say, follow these scenarios, this kind of dystopic scenario of a future in which oil disappeared, but was used as a drug, actually, as a drug in this kind of underground world. And the second collaboration was with the artist, Norwegian artist Dyvi, there was basically a kind of long-term following the construction of an oil platform. And so it was looking at the way in which relationship with workers was changing as this huge crisis of the oil sector unfolded. In 2016, there was a total crash of the price of oil. And in Norway, there were something like 100,000, 150,000 oil workers made redundant. And so we were looking at this, again, this kind of clash between the fact that these workers anyway were going to receive some state support, but also the dimension of the workers' displacement and the violence of this mass redundancy that actually, was not documented at all. And so we followed the making of this platform, and especially focus on the politics of the trade union, which again was living this conflict of hoping that the oil in the future would disappear for future generation, and at the same time being aware that oil is what gave income to the trade union members. So this is, let's say, essentially what I've been doing.
Yeah, great. So this left us with a kind of exploration, but one that was very much dependent on what we were on the tangible that we were able to follow into spheres that might have been less visible, less materialized. And that then, for our next project, which is starting now at Bach as a 2-year fellowship, we've decided to extend and build on what we had been doing, but really to allow it to lead us in the direction of a far less visible, far less tangible notion of infrastructure, which we're provisionally calling spectral infrastructure. And the sort of where Mao mentioned a minute ago about the kind of disruptive, that infrastructure was not only a support structure, but it was also often disruptive. It was often an entanglement whose outcomes weren't clear. I think what we're trying to follow now is the notion of infrastructure as both hidden and haunting, right? So invisible, intangible, and at the same time, having a haunting presence that one cannot get away from. And I think that one of the things that I was interested in, as Mao said, we both work at Goldsmiths in different contexts. one of the things that has interested me continuously about Goldsmiths as an institution is that while it may not be the most efficiently run institution, and it might not be entirely at peace with the kind of financialized values that are being imposed on it at present. What is continuously there and present is the kind of aftermath of certain people who either ran it or worked in it or were close collaborators. So Richard Hoggart, who was an enormously important figure on the British left, and who was in a way the person who first started speaking about cultural studies in the 1950s already. Stuart Hall, who was the teacher of many people who work at Goldsmiths, but also a close collaborator of many of us. The sort of people like Dick Hebdige and Kobena Mercer and many others. I don't want to kind of take up too much time with a list of names, but really many others whose work, who might no longer be living, might no longer be there, but whose work has been a kind of continuously disruptive haunt of the place and of our understanding of what an educational institution could actually be. And so, but it's not a haunt that is ever marked or celebrated or really understood. And seemingly in an institution whose direction is the exact opposite from that kind of critical disruption. And so this interested me very much. And for me, it was an entry point into the notion of spectral infrastructure, a kind of invisible, intangible presence that nevertheless holds us, that nevertheless kind of structures and impacts the ways in which we think and work and act without it being a kind of acknowledged influence as such. And so this is one of the pathways by which we got into the notion of spectral infrastructure, understanding that infrastructure is not a one-off project, that it's a many-layered kind of endeavor, and that what we have to do is delve into the less and less and less visible and tangible and materialized dimensions of it to understand the hold that it has on us, because that's really the aim. The aim is to kind of come to terms with the hold that infrastructure has on us. For the beginning of this project, together with Nora Sternfeld, who's become a kind of close collaborator also beyond free thought, we're thinking about the concept of the unarchivable. And I guess that links directly to what I was just saying about this haunted institutional life that I've been in for the past 20 years. That we're thinking about the unarchivable in the sense of what has no category through which it might be archived. It might be remembered. And we're thinking of a lot of kind of cultural activity around us that is pointing to notions of the unarchivable through kind of strategies of invention. You know, the half documentary, half fictional work of Saidiya Hartman, various artists who've invented archives, because the quality, if we think, let's say, of Walid Raad's efforts to find a way to inhabit the civil war in Lebanon, required the invention of a whole set of archives through which he and subsequently we as viewers might find an entry point into a civil war that is so entangled and so complex and so not available to victims and perpetrator kind of binaries, that it needs another strategy. So we're thinking about the unarchivable, and thinking about how we might first look at some examples, and from that kind of draw out a holding, a kind of holding space for things that have not been archived, cannot be archived, and yet continue to provide us with a kind of prehistory of who we are and how we function. The other part of this is the work that I'm doing with Luis Moreno, and this is we're calling this sediments and residues, and we're trying to sort of understand how cultural moments, political moments, social moments, when they are not captured, how they might nevertheless operate as something in the wake of which we come. So we're very much looking to literature, to political movements, to artistic activities, in order to try and kind of make clear this notion of a sediment or a residue that is not a named geological strata or any other kind of strata, and nevertheless on which we find ourselves somehow planted. Okay.
Yes, so in relationship to how I have thought about spectral infrastructure as an evolution of our previous experiment in Bergen, was that, as also Irit mentioned, the spectral has slowly become much more present in terms of everyday human condition. And so I'm thinking, especially in terms of this kind of shift in broader political economy in relationship to the kind of surplus populations. And so the idea of the spectral has become a co-presence, especially in terms of labor. And this is something that the pandemic has highlighted a lot, this kind of trade-off between life and the economy. This idea of these kind of key workers who are hero, but nonetheless are unpaid or underpaid, have to continue to perform this kind of really spectral labor, in the sense that these are labor associated with mortality, with death. And so thinking that this was a new condition in which the spectral is much more present in our daily life, everyday life. And so this kind of ontological labor of looking for these absences in everyday life becomes very important and very central. So a kind of this kind of encounters with the non-human, with this kind of debilitating, with this toxic presence of the spectrum. And so in terms of a kind of framework, for me, if in Bergen, my framework was kind of dialectic. So the idea was to looking at the invisible as a form of a critique of the visible, the infrastructure as a critique of the structure. Here, the framework is different and has to be different. And so that's where, let's say, the performativity of the notion of the spectral becomes important, because really it's about having a different kind of epistemology of maybe attunement, of stepping back, of, this kind of looking for absences, which is also what Boaventura de Sousa Santos discusses as the kind of sociology of absences. And as Irit also was mentioning, culture as this kind of zone of contact, and so I'm very interested in this kind of ethnographic space, this kind of suspension in time and space between locality, geographies, and histories. And that's another thing that really also, that inspires me and inspire also in the work of other artists and thinkers. This idea of cultural rearticulation, and in conversation with Irit, and more recently also with Stefano, we've been thinking about this idea of cultural rearticulation in relationship to coolitude, which is a notion that Khal Torabully, Trinidadian poet, forged, this idea of this kind of space of indentured labor that becomes not only a kind of an heritage of the global South, but becomes also the contemporary condition. So this is something that we explore with Stefano. And more recently, I'm interested in, let's say, also a series of conversations I've been having with Denise da Silva, who has been looking at the notion of, let's say, the legacy of slavery on contemporary capitalism, and highlighting how the spectrality of labor continues to be a contemporary condition. And so we are looking at this also, we are trying to articulate the spectrum in relationship to labor, but also conversations I've been having with Elizabeth Povinelli about ways in which, let's say, the labor of the Carabin collective, the labor of making films, is a form of remediation, of literally framing in a different medium relationship with white settler colonialism, relationship that they've been having. So I think this is more or less.
Yeah, and maybe what you just said about framing in a different medium brings us to the fact that all of us come from different disciplines, different bodies of knowledge, different kind of methods. And one of the things that I think is really important about free thought, that it's not a collective of expertise, that the sort of important part of it is to step out of expertise and to think about points of convergence, points of entanglement, and as Mao just said, framing in different mediums. But the expertise is a great trap, and it's a kind of trap of mastery that one wants to, as a researcher, as an educator, I think it's the trap of mastery that one wants to get away from at all times. And in a way, one part of what's interesting about the way in which free thought works is that coming from such different backgrounds, having a kind of foundation of different knowledges, there is a way in which what you know and how you see the world is constantly jostled, which is something that I value very much. So it's not about us producing something for a public to consume. It's about us engaging together in a sometimes uncomfortable process of collective research and collective study. And then trying to put something out there that might draw others into the kind of process of thinking or the struggle with something. And that for me is what I value in free thought.
I agree, me too.